one for the road. Prologue. The sun had finally fallen. It was nearly time to travel on. He sat at his table in the saloon alone and nursed a bottle of rotgut. It tasted like ash on his tongue and stoked no fire in his belly but for one blessed, fleeting moment when the liquor first kissed his lips and he could almost taste that familiar woody smokiness and feel faint memories of that tender warming of the insides, like ghosts lingering in the hollow ballroom of some great abandoned manse. Now there was only ash and dust and grit and cold. He had been passing time in the saloon since he arose a while after noon, and time had been passing terribly slowly. A great restlessness had risen inside him, a terrible, maddening boredom, and a deep, familiar hunger. He gambled for hours and had won several good hands of hold'em. His luck was up, and he knew when to cash out. When your luck is up, you walk away. When it's down, you run. Or shoot, he thought, and chuckled wryly as you might when sharing an inside joke with a friend. His luck had, up until tonight, been down, way down. That spot of trouble in Arkansas had almost been the end of him. He could not remember the last time he'd felt anything like, God, was it fear? Actual fear? The thought disgusted him, filled him with shame. Regardless, his luck had turned when it counted, and he made it out. God bless Samuel Colt. He chuckled aloud to himself, raising the wretched bottle to the air in a toast and taking another swig. Colt's development had been a dramatic one, a world above everything that had come before it. 6 rounds at a rotating cylinder. A man could fire them off just as fast as he could squeeze the trigger. It was the pinnacle of individual human power thus far. The lethality of it infatuated him, and his mind delighted in imagining what they might achieve next. It was Colt's ingenious little death dealers, 2 to be precise, that had allowed him to gun down the 4 hunters who had come searching for him on that frosty January morning. He was a quick draw and an exceptionally good shot, but still he was nagged by a terrible thought, that the events of that day had played out the way they had more so because of luck rather than skill. The closeness between him and death that morning was a feeling he would never forget, and from now on, he would make sure to keep his distance. To die on the porch of some pathetic ranch house in the ass end of nowhere simply would not do. In Arkansas, he had grown much too comfortable. He knew that now, but the wide openness of it all, the sheer isolation, it had lulled him. He never thought anyone would catch wind of what he'd done with the rancher, what he had done to the old man's wife and daughters, how he had taken their idyllic little ranch and shaped it into his own personal Sodom. Those had been foolishly bold assumptions to make. Eventually, perhaps simply for lack of sight of the family in town for months. Though he believed there was something more to it, he felt that in his gut, the wrong people had picked up his trail and come to burn him out. All they had succeeded in burning was the rancher and his kin to a crisp. The irony in that was not lost on him. It helped to raise his spirits when he thought of the whole rotten predicament. Even his being forced to flee to this podunk North Texas cattle town had proven to be quite fortuitous, though. 2 nights ago, he had heard talk between 2 cowpokes about gold in the hills of California, and somehow known that was to be his new destination. He needed no convincing that their tale was true. He could somehow feel it. He heard it calling to him, beckoning him to come and become all that he was meant to be. Had he still believed in him, he would have thought it was a message from God. He would travel north through Creek territory in Oklahoma, and then pick up the Oregon Trail in Kansas. He had no fear of the Redskins. From him they seemed to know to keep their distance, as though they saw him for what he truly was. They would be a bane to any pursuers, though, and displeased him. Should the dead men in Arkansas have any compatriots on his trail, unlikely as it may be. But first, he needed a drink. And not of cheap, ashy whiskey, no. He needed something much richer. The hunger thrummed inside him maddeningly, like a terrible void threatening to consume even itself if not sated. He only needed one for the road. One to hold himself over for a while. His eyes were those of a predator on the prowl, locked in on the group of drunks at one of the card tables. The first fool to shamble outside for a piss would be his, and then he would be on his way. He could have seduced the barmaid hours ago and taken her. He found it quite easy to charm women, despite having no real interest in sex. He often pursued it even though it held no pleasure for him anymore, a function memorized by his body and carried out without his will. It was an old habit, an empty gesture, a ghost, like the bottle in his hand. Taking the barmaid, though, would almost certainly see him discovered, and he would not risk another Arkansas. The hunger was now screaming inside him, and the smell of iron in the air was tantalizing, almost entrancing. He could feel his self-control subtly slipping away from him. He fixated on one gambler at the table, assuring himself that he had found his prey. The man was deeply in his cups. His small pile of cash had steadily dwindled to nearly nothing. He had watched the man in his patched woolen work shirt lose for the better part of an hour and knew that soon he would push away from the table in a fit of drunken defeat, shame, and rage. It was almost time. He had only to contain himself a little longer. He hoped he could. When the unlucky soul's last dollar had exchanged hands, he arose shakily and hurled a slew of curses at his fellow gamblers. These were met not with outrage, nor fists, nor raised pistols, but with a chorus of laughter, the way one might laugh off the threats of an especially rambunctious child. His prey's entire body seemed to slump in impotence. One of the gamblers shouted, "God damn, boy! They should have put you out of your misery. You are ugly and pig shit." And chortled tremendously, inciting a new bout of laughter from his fellows. The loser slinked away, now completely broken it would seem, and made his way, with considerable effort, through the bat-winged doors and into the early spring night. His hunt was begun. He pursued with the strange gait he had developed intuitively over the ages, which bade men look away for reasons unknown to them, bade him as difficult to perceive as a dream upon waking. If they had survived that night, folk in the saloon may have gone on to tell tales about a strange blur flashing across the room that made them feel ill to look upon. If asked about that pale man who drank his rot gut at a table alone and hardly spoke to a soul, they would tremble uncontrollably and struggle to describe his features before refusing to discuss it further. Some would vomit. Some would weep. After a short time, they would forget him entirely, recalling only a lonely bottle of whiskey that someone had seemingly abandoned at a table that night, although they would still tremble when some dark part of their subconscious unwittingly stumbled across that hazy memory, like a locked-up chest full of a dead man's belongings. That would never leave them. Night greeted him like an old friend, and he became it. The appetizing scent of iron was carried by the breeze and guided his way like a signal fire. He could hear his prey's heart pumping its essence diligently within him. His body quivered in anticipation. Clyde Glick hit the dirt and gravel of the town's one and only road, cursing and kicking over stones as he went. He was soused and staggering in a zigzag through the road. It was all he could do to keep from falling over. Pete Wortham and the others were probably still laughing at him, thinking he had turned tail and run. But all he needed was a piss and some fresh air, and then he would be back. He couldn't well avenge himself against Wortham and his gang of clowns stumbling around with a full bladder. No, the most likely end to that scenario would only be him making a further fool of himself. Life had turned on Clyde Glick almost immediately following his maiming. Once, he had commanded respect and fear. Now men mocked him. Women snickered behind his back. And the only fear he inspired now was in small children, out of disgust. Once, the slaves of the Milton plantation had gone before him with all the meekness of whipped hounds. After the pack of runaway coons had beaten him bloody and carved off his nose, they had grown bold, even going so far as to deny his commands and mock the intensity of his whippings. He had hoped, while still healing, that the grisly skull-like visage those mongrels had left him with would instill fear in Edward Milton's remaining slaves, but with patented Glick luck, it had only served as a reminder of his own mortality. The gaping hole in his face was a glimmer of hope. If one group could do it, so could others. And so, it was only a matter of time before Mr. Milton had let him go. He held no ill will towards his employers, though. It was only business. One could not have an overseer who could not command respect. And Milton had even brought in his own personal physician to treat his wounds. If it weren't for that, he would have almost certainly died of infection. Now, it was time to earn back at least some of that respect. He'd had enough of being the town laughingstock. He was going to pump Wortham and his cronies full of so much lead their chests would rattle if they had breath left to laugh. He only had to sober up. He drew in one deep, sweet breath of spring night air and then another, savoring them like a fine wine. His mind was beginning to clear up as the air started to dry out his liquor-soaked brain. He inhaled deeply for a third time and was greeted not by the grassy notes of spring, but a smell that was sickeningly sweet and acrid. It seemed to force its way into his mouth, in the ruin of his nose, threatening to suffocate him with its cloyingly sweet meatiness. He retched up his dinner compulsively. It was the stench of rotting flesh, of mass graves and charnel pits, and despite his disgust, he found himself bizarrely intoxicated by it. It willed him to turn around, and he felt himself obeying as though in a trance. His bladder loosed against his will even before he truly saw what was upon him. He felt a warmth spread across the front of his trousers with detachment. His sphincter tightened and gooseflesh rippled across his body. He began to shiver uncontrollably despite the pleasant early spring evening. An internal hackle had risen. Deep within him, something seemed to awaken in alarm, something originating from the long-forgotten animal within, something whose only instinct was survival and sense for danger was preternatural. Something that screamed to run or fight or even feign death, and yet he froze. He stared in vacant horror as a form began to materialize out of the very darkness. Somewhere far away he heard a pathetic thin scream, more of a squeal than anything else, as the writhing blur of night and mist produced corpse-pale hands bearing long, thin, claw-like fingers. They groped for him hungrily. He considered reaching for the revolver at his side for a moment, but his body disobeyed him. Suddenly, he was certain he would die here, and was almost satisfied with it. Let it all end before things get worse, as they always seem to. The only thing stuck in his craw was that Wortham and his bunch would have the last laugh after all. But things like that didn't matter to the dead. The cloying corpse smell was everywhere now, but it had almost begun to smell of freshly cut roses to him. When the stark white face finally emerged from the shadows, it was flashing a horrific grin of needle-like teeth. Its mad blood-red eyes bored down upon him with force. The stare seemed to reach into him, to see the deep, dark thoughts he kept hidden from the world. It smothered him, somehow weighed him down, but he would not have run even if he could. He was at a peace known only to those who have truly accepted death. But as the creature closed its distance and he was certain it was about to use its fangs to tear out his throat, instead, it spoke. Clyde Glick, what a poor hand life has dealt you, eh, friend? The creature's voice was calm and melodious as it smiled sympathetically. Clyde tried to speak but could not. He felt as though he might choke on his own tongue. Don't bother. Nothing needs to be said, Clyde. I see you. I want to help you. You want to help me? Each word struggled its way from his mouth. Yes, Clyde. All you need do is say the word. You can have the power you desire, the respect, the fear. But why? Clyde asked, dumbfounded. The creature's eyes never left his. The bloody irises seemed to shift and swirl as if liquid. I see potential in you, Clyde. You just need a spot of help from a friend. My name is Victor Carlyle. Would you like my gift, Clyde? Clyde only stared in disbelief. Come on, Clyde. Together we'll show Peter Wortham and his friends real misery. They'll be begging you to end it. The thing was still smiling. Clyde needed no more convincing. He had gone from believing his life over to this. It seemed irrefusable. Finally, the world would know him. It would tremble before him. It would piss itself and accept death. He nodded in agreement, and the darkness fell upon with a rush of cold weight. He felt a sweet, slight sting of pain at his neck and the warm flow of blood leaving his body, followed by a rush of thick, feverish backflow that seemed to corrode its way slowly through his veins and into his heart. He felt it fill with a terrible ichor and then stop pumping as the sleep of death fell over him. It was warm. For a moment he almost thought he was a child again, napping in the tall grass on a summer afternoon. But when he awakened, there was only cold, the cold of the grave.
One for the Road by Christopher Sotelo.